since we are not observing any of the international laws that we ought to be observing, they are simply saying, probably, they want the kind of security that we want for ourselves. And I can't see anything very peculiar about that. But disaster at the end of the road, certainly.
Right, and disaster, in your view, would be an increased nuclear proliferation and...
Absolutely, but we will never deal with that until we start taking abolition negotiations seriously ourselves.
Douglas, is that the way you see things?
Well, no, patent nonsense. I mean, Mr. Kent is once again assuming benign intentions of our enemies and castigating ourselves. The problem is not with the West. The idea of disarmament on the West's part at this point, or any movement in that direction, would be absurd. That anyone is still talking about disarmament of our nuclear capability at a time that North Korea has just made a test, and Iran is a few years with reach with a bomb, is nonsensical. It's absurd. It's a suicide.
But actually, we increase the capability with Trident, 6,000-mile range, high degree of accuracy. It's the quality of the nuclear weapons that actually matter, and the implication that your security depends on having some of them. And if that message goes around the world, then the North Koreas and the Irans will follow suit.
So it would be a good idea at this point in history for Britain to disarm its nuclear capability just as North Korea has its and Iran has its. Is that going to make a difference? Yeah, is there any evidence you have that North Korea or Iran have ever followed our wishes on these things, have ever listened to our international obligations, or are likely to start doing so now?
It would be a very good idea if we sat round a table and began the process of negotiating, inviting North Korea and Iran to come along. Why not?
Exactly. 1993, North Korea withdrew from the treaty. Has any leverage happened in that time? Can anyone honestly say that the treatment we're now going towards Iran is anything other than indicative of what we've just seen with North Korea? That a regime like that can withdraw from all international obligations, and people like you sit around asking us to obey treaties which our enemies will never obey. And what's more, you've given benign trust that perhaps Iran isn't trying to develop a bomb.
Why is Iran in the dock? Why isn't India, Pakistan and Israel in the dock? They've all done
Why
this
would
thing
Israel
before.
be in the dock?
Why wouldn't it? It's got 200 at least nuclear warheads. It's not signed the NPT.
Well, I think the major difference is that Iran has said, I mean, Ahmadinejad has said he wants to extinguish Israel. He said he wants to wipe it off the map. In fact, he said on Al-Quds Day, October 20th, only a few days ago, that Israel has no right to exist and that it soon will not.
Or we might have Mr. Khatami's Al-Quds Day
speech. 2 to 1, I
suppose. We might have Mr. Khatami, the so-called moderates, response in Al-Quds in 2003, saying that they only need one bomb, because they only need one bomb to kill every Israeli, and they'll have to have lots of bombs to get rid of all of that.
For 1 second, let's just look. Do we firstly believe that Iran is dedicated to building a nuclear weapon? I mean, Bruce, do you think that...
I don't know. How can anybody know? I don't know. I know the senior Ayatollah has said that it would be against the Quran to develop a nuclear bomb. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that's...
There's not much in the Quran about the nuclear bomb.
Why don't we listen to each other seriously and not just insult each other?
Well, let's listen to the Iranian leadership, which has consistently over recent years said what it wants to do. This isn't just a one-off statement. It's not just one speech of Mr. Ahmadinejad or Mr. Rafsanjani or Mr. Khatami. This is consistent speeches. We don't have to guess what they want to do. They've told us. One thing you must admit you have to do if you have an enemy, if you have somebody who is talking about wiping you out, one thing you should do is believe them.
But wiping out is not the word. It's actually dismantling the state of Israel, which at the moment is in a very difficult position with the position it's in, and I actually can't see how a two-state solution can any longer work with the settlements. But that's, Israel is out of line with international opinion and law on nuclear weapons.
I mean, how would you answer, actually, I mean, Bruce has made a point, obviously, that why is Iran in the dock, as opposed to, say, India and Pakistan, both of whom have, of course, threatened each other at various points with military actions? I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, the escalation between Pakistan and India is very regrettable. I don't think anyone, looking back, wishes that, that India and Pakistan couldn't have got, could have been prevented from getting the bomb. As it is, we are where we are with them, and with no likelihood that we're going to be able to persuade either side to dismantle their nuclear capability, which they regard as being important for their strategic interests. But one of the things we don't see in either Pakistan or India is a desire expressed by the leadership of those countries to wipe out an entire state unprovoked because of an historical hatred. We don't see that from either of those states. We don't see it from any state at the moment other than Iran.
Talking is all about them not getting it. There's no talking about us starting negotiations which might remove nuclear weapons from Britain. Or America. That's not part of the deal.
But should the two be linked? I mean, why should they be linked? Surely...
Because we have an international obligation that they should be linked from the International Court of Justice. It's a common problem, and a common solution has been proposed. But the nuclear powers are so chauvinist and so nationalistic. We saw the Indians leaping up and down with joy once they got one. That pattern is going to be followed, and I think it's a tragedy. And there'll be an accident. Nobody talks about the number of nuclear accidents. We've had all kinds of nuclear accidents. And McNamara was over here not long ago, and he said of the Cuba crisis, we were bloody lucky. That was his expression. And he was. We were.
Douglas?
Well, I like the assumption, or if one took that as being true, I like the assumption still that one would give benefit of the doubt to a regime like Tehran's, which Mr. Kent keeps on seeming to think we have no hints about its nature. He seems to assume that anything that happened in the way of disarmament from the Western nuclear powers would induce Tehran to stand down. I mean, I think this is naivety, which, I mean, if it was simply naive, then, I mean, it would be sad. But this is dangerous. I mean, this is talking about the survival of our culture, the survival of whole nations. And you're talking about it as if it's just simply being nice to somebody and saying to Iran, oh, if we do this, why wouldn't you be nice in return? I mean, this is just monstrous. This is a regime that tortures and murders its own people that have no sense of justice. Do you honestly think the ICJ is they're going to start obeying that? Mr. Ahmadinejad's regime has no sense of justice at home, it has no sense of justice abroad, and you're talking about allowing us to walk straight into the trap of allowing them a nuclear bomb.
I'm doing nothing of the sort. I'm suggesting the beginning negotiations. We have hundreds of regimes, dozens of regimes with appalling records of human rights, and we aren't exactly so wonderful. Guantanamo Bay is not exactly a five-star prize, is it, for the West?
I'd like the fact that the onus is on the democracies to prove their goodness, but we have to prove the badness of autocratic, theofascist regimes. I can't understand your reasoning on this, any more than I can understand your assumption. I seem to remember the last time we spoke was during the Lebanon War, when I was speaking from the battle zone in northern Israel. And I remember then that you objected to Israel's right to self-defense in a non-nuclear way. You object now to Israel's right to nuclear defense. It's very hard for somebody not simply to come to the conclusion you simply don't believe Israel has any right to defense, any right to exist.
That's nonsense, absolute raving nonsense. I believe that nobody is entitled to nuclear weapons. I think they're instruments of mass destruction, and I think they violate the Geneva and Hague Conventions, full stop. Of course Israel has a right to exist within secure borders, and so does Palestine within secure borders. And the problem is no one is prepared to sit down and start doing the division. And in fact, they've so planted settlements that the division is effectively impossible.
And again, the onus there is on Israel, not on the Hezbollah or on Lebanon or anyone else. It's the democracy that's castigated. It's the theofascists that get away with it.
I just want to present a scenario.
And on this matter as well, I mean, this is an important thing. Let's just take, well, not in the way Mr. Ahmadinejad means, but let's just take Israel out of the equation for a moment. The best case scenario we see in the Middle East, if Iran continues to get away with this, if it continues to flap, the best case scenario is a nuclear rush across the Middle East. We know there are already deals being done in the background. We know that Mr. Khan's network will get straight in and work with Saudi and all the other countries. So the best thing that will happen if you don't stand up to Iran now is that you have a Middle East that goes nuclear to core within 10 years.
So what needs to happen?
That is the price
what needs to happen right now?
At this
Given
point.
Russia's causing problems at the Security Council, what needs to happen right now?
What needs to happen is that the serious deadline needs to be given to Iran within a very short space of time. And the most important thing that has to happen is that the Western powers, primarily Britain and America, make it clear to Tehran that force is on the table. I've never heard anything so absurd as former Secretary Jack Straw's claim that there was no, that the military option was off the table. I've never heard of a negotiation between nation states in which force is seriously off the table. These discussions aren't academic things. They're not tea mornings. They're occasions when states sit down and leverage power between each other. And if you take force off the table, if you say to Iran, we're really serious about this, but we will never even consider the use of force, that isn't a negotiation.
Well, that was perhaps, I mean, the UK and the US playing good cop, bad cop. But also, I mean, you say setting another deadline. We've set several deadlines. The Iranians have just stepped over them, and then sort of giving us the middle finger. So what is...
I'm saying a serious deadline, at which point you say
us?
that we take out the facilities by this...
Rather like last year in Edinburgh, they left out, they did make poverty history, but they never talked about the $1 trillion a year we spend on war.
So the military being polluters, Douglas?
No,
you're looking sceptical.
It's impossible to know even where to begin on this. No, the green issue, this is a great opportunity for anti-war lobbies to collide their two pet things, which is global warming and the military, and to claim now that the military might be responsible for global warming. I mean, I can't see it's even a serious story.
Alex?
Not a problem. But I think we have to start thinking about other forms of security. You and I are not armed, but we're sitting here in a perfectly pleasant sort of way. Maybe we can be a bit rude to each other if we want to be, but we're not going to kill each other. Why don't we think about security in other ways than being armed to the teeth against somebody else? And that is the normal condition of human life, but it's not one we practice internationally.
It's so abnormal that it's never happened.
It happens all the time.
Alex?
All the time.
Because as the EU and NATO expands into that area, we could find that by 2017, when the Russians may have the Black Sea Fleet, the biggest naval fleet within the EU, within EU waters, if Ukraine is to become part of the EU before that or around that time. So I think that's significant.
Douglas?
Yeah, it's an interesting so I hadn't followed it. So.
Do you think it follows the general pattern that we're seeing with Putin at the moment?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, Putin, in my mind, is a rather hard leader to read, and I think it's rather hard to tell what his ambitions at this point are. He gives off rather different signs. I mean, obviously, he wants his nation to remain looking like a global power of some kind. It doesn't look that way to me from the outside at the moment. And much as you know, the Russian military force is decaying beyond repair, as it were, and is looking rather like an old battleship that's not really worthy to go to sea.
It's environmental pollution, in fact.
I don't think that's causing it.
Who knows where NATO's going to go next? I mean, no one ever thought of Afghanistan as a place for NATO when NATO started.
Israeli entry is the most
So maybe. Let's have a global NATO. Why not, while we're at it?
Could be interesting if it works. Douglas, your story, please.
Oh, it's a very different story. I thought that one of the stories of the week, which will not get much coverage elsewhere, but is being covered a little bit in the Dutch media at any rate, is a very small-scale thing, I suppose, for people outside of Holland, but I think a very large problem for democracy, which is that Geert Wilders, who runs a very small party in Holland, which has been ostracized in recent years. Geert Wilders himself, much like Alan Hessiali, has to spend his life under armed guard, in security, has to live on army bases, has an exceedingly unpleasant existence. In the campaigning for next month's elections, two of his supporters in the north of Holland were putting up posters and were severely beaten by local Muslim Morocco lads. This might not seem like a big thing, but I think it is. I think it's very worrying that the process of democracy cannot safely go on in a European country without people fearing for their lives for supporting a political party which is not extremist, which is simply supporting a man who is much hated by large proportions of that country.
They go in there almost not clothed. Yeah. And so I think that there's all these frictions. And
school children in Denmark who swim in different pools, so the girls and boys in different pools because Muslim girls can't swim with infidel boys.
Clash of civilizations?
Well, I think our job is to build bridges and everywhere we can. These are bizarre things, of course, but I know all sorts of Muslims who actually wouldn't agree with the sort of thing they were talking about. Well, after all, in Northern Ireland, we had Catholics and Protestants beating up each other for voting in the wrong place or voting for the wrong candidate, which is not an Islamic affair, unfortunately. It's a tendency which I think is to be deplored anywhere it starts. And it is a threat to democracy. People should be able to vote freely for a candidate they want to. Absolutely. I agree with you, Douglas. There we are.
Painful. Painful, but it's true. I think
there's real problems, I think, in that part of Pakistan.
Douglas, it is a problem, isn't it? The Pakistani
yes,
situation.
of course. I mean, it's been a problem we've all known about for the last 5 years. I remember, I think that on the day after 9/11, Dick Armitage was seeing the Pakistanis, and he said to them, no, history starts today. He said, when they said, no, we've got a long problem going back many years with Taliban and so on, he said, no, history starts today. Sadly, history only seemed to have begun that day.
Pakistan have just signed an agreement, did they not, with several of the frontier tribes peoples, which seems to
make some difference. But I mean, the problem always is with whether or not knowing whether or not the ISI, for instance, the Pakistani security service, is really on our side. And I mean, every time you can trace, it's very interesting, trace the number when an top Al Qaeda guy is given up by the ISI. It is always at a crucial moment when the West is lining something. They know exactly when to put somebody in our direction.